It has been said that Ernest Hemingway is the most influential author since Shakespeare. I didn't say a better author, I said an influential author. Because Hemingway's influence, Hemingway's contributions are still being so strong. He stated simply changed the way we write in English. From the elaborate Victorian language of Dickens and all the great romantics, Hemingway simplified, pared down the language, reduced it to the essential, created works where, the paragraphs are small, the sentences are direct, with few adjectives and adverbs. And this type of writing has become the standard writing of English. Every time that we tell a young person in high school to write a short paragraph to get to the point, what we're doing is we're reminding them of the contributions of Ernest Hemingway. You can see it in our journalism, the way the newspapers and the magazines are written. All of that is completely different from the type of English that was done before Hemingway. There's a description of Hemingway that I like a lot by his friend Hotchner, who says that he was massive, not in height, for he was only an inch over 6 feet, nor in weight, but in impact. Most of his 200 pounds were concentrated above his waist. He had square, heavy shoulders, long, hugely muscled arms, deep chest, no hips or thighs. And then Hotchner says, something played off him. He was intense, electrokinetic, but in control, like a racehorse reined in. I had never seen anyone with such an aura of fun and well-being. He radiated it, and everyone in the place responded. So Hemingway is the author of masterpieces like The Old Man and the Sea, For Whom the Bell Tolls, a novel so ambitious that it tries to recreate in English the feel for Spanish. It's probably the best short story writer of the century as well. And his capacity of observing and recreating the way people talk, the dialogues of people, is fascinating. I'm going to get into a deeper understanding of his style that goes way beyond the short paragraphs and the direct sentences, and has to do with an inner sincerity, an inner discipline in our capacity to observe and describe the world. But Hemingway is not only an author, he is also a man of action. He is simultaneously an outdoorsman, a hunter, a deep sea fisherman, a man who did all kinds of sports, who liked to box, who used guns, a completely different type of intellectual, a person that was equally comfortable in a museum as in a bar, and whose contributions are still being felt today. So this is the story of Ernest Hemingway. He was born in Oak Park, Illinois, the 21st of July of 1899. So if you want to figure out his age as we advance through this presentation, just add a year to the century. His father was a doctor, Edmund Clarence Edmonds Hemingway. And the mother, Grace, was a very complicated woman. She had been an opera singer who had even performed at the Metropolitan, but she had a very delicate eyesight and said that the lights of the stage hurt her vision and gave her terrible headaches, so that she had become now a housewife. But she always reminded everyone in the family that she had sacrificed a brilliant career to take care of them. And she would do absolutely nothing in the house other than order people around. Some of the patients of Dr. Hemingway would remember that he would do not just the cooking on special occasions, he would do all the cooking. Patients would remember how in the middle of the day, he would pick up the phone and give directions on taking the pie out of the oven and things of that nature. What Grace did do was to provide her children with an artistic education. She was a music teacher. She directed a choir. So she introduces Hemingway to art, to music. She exposes him to the work of Johann Sebastian Bach and Beethoven, and of course, the great operas. They have a comfortable upper middle class life. And another of the eccentricities of the mother was Hemingway had a sister that was 18 months older than him, Marceline. And this mother conceives this kind of strange fantasy, this idea that she had had twins, girl twins. And so she dressed them exactly alike. And this would go on several years. Here you see Hemingway, whom she liked to call my darling summer girl. This bothered Ernest to no end. And the summers, the family would go to a camp where Hemingway had a chance to be a boy. And this, of course, was the influence of the father. The father was a great outdoorsman. And so he teaches the young boy to hunt, to fish, to be in contact with nature. There are also American indigenous tribes that he connects with. In school, he was an average student. He never was a distinguished athlete. But what he did do very well was writing. Even as a student, he begins publishing stories in the newspaper. And when he graduates, he does not want to go to college. His ambition, the US is about to get involved in, or has been already involved in World War I. And so Hemingway wants to join the war effort, but he's still not 18. And for him to join, it would have been necessary for the family to sign a permission that they don't do. Here you see the father congratulating Hemingway after he graduates. And since he doesn't want to go to college, they reach a compromise and they send him to Kansas City to work in the Kansas City Star, which is a newspaper. Now, this newspaper, the Kansas City Star, has a style book that are exactly the rules that Hemingway would use to transform the English language. No slang, short sentences, few adjectives, getting to the point. all of these things that people followed half-heartedly, but that Hemingway fully embraces. Now, at the time, Kansas City is completely ruled by the mafia. And so in every neighborhood, there is crime, there is violence. And Hemingway gets a chance to cover this. And for him, coming from a suburb, it is completely different to his earlier experience. So it would instill in him a deep impression that would stay with him all his life. He would always be very close to the common man. He would be able to know how the thief talks, the battler, stories of these people that are, in the lower parts of society, the criminal, do stories, extraordinary stories like the killers or the battler or many others. And this early experience in Kansas City covering all these issues would have a deep influence in his later work. He becomes 18, and so he tries to enroll in the army, but he's got a lot of problems of vision in one eye. And so he can't join as a soldier. And so what he does is that he joins as a volunteer of the Red Cross. So he's in Italy, in northern Italy, and his job is quite simple. He basically volunteers to go to the front and to give candies and chocolates to the soldiers. So he's doing this job when a big Austrian cannon falls a few feet away from him. And more than 200 pieces of metal are encrusted in his leg. And still in this condition, he's able to carry a fellow soldier to safety. And as he does, he gets shot again by the enemy. So he's the first American to be wounded in Italy. And this is at the very beginning of the involvement. So he goes to the hospital when there are like 4 patients and 18 nurses. And here, he recovers from his wounds that are very, very serious. He even makes like a ring with part of the metal, the shrapnel that was into his leg. But he would meet a beautiful nurse, Agnes von Kurowski, that is older than him. And he falls in love with her. And she reciprocates. And for a moment, he's convinced that she loves him and that he's going to marry her. And in many ways, his second novel, Farewell to Arms, is inspired in his relationship to Agnes. And it has beautiful descriptions like this one about Agnes's hair. She said, she had wonderfully beautiful hair, and I would lie sometimes and watch her twist up in the light that came in the open door window. It shone even in the night, as water shines sometimes just before it is really daylight. So he is decorated for his heroism. He receives a medal from the Italian government, and he comes back to the US as a war hero. And so he begins to do these lectures. And at first, he tells his own experience, his own story. But then he finds that you can build a truer story if you fuse not just your experience, but the experience of other people into that story. In other words, that you can, that though maybe it was not literally true that everything happened to him, but by incorporating these different strands into the story that he's telling, he's creating something that is more truthful than if he were limiting it only and exclusively to his experience. So in a way, these lectures that he does anticipate his future work as a writer. And we must say that beyond the physical wounds, he conserves a bit of a limp, but he's able to gradually overcome. But he has all this trauma that at the time was not even given a name. Now we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. But he would describe how he had a lot of trouble sleeping. He said, I myself did not want to sleep because I had been living for a long time with the knowledge that if I ever shut my eyes in the dark and let myself go, my soul would go out of my body. Now, it becomes very difficult for Hemingway to readapt to society after the war. His family and kind of expect him to be the same as he was before. But he couldn't be. This world, this Victorian world that he had been raised in and his mother believed in, had been shattered forever in the war. And in many ways, the radical purification of the language is not just a stylistic affair. It has to do with the contrast between this elaborate rhetoric and the brutal reality of life. And he sees that all these concepts of honor, of courage, all this flowery speeches meant nothing in World War I, where the weapons had been modernized, but the strategies continued to be the same. And so as a result, sometimes in a single battle, you had tens of thousands of young people dead for nothing. War, the war itself, World War I is a war where nobody really understands why it begins. There's an aristocrat that is killed, and so then one country declares war on another, and then the ally of the country declares war. And pretty soon, you know, it becomes an entire war, carnage, horrible things. And the language cannot be the same as it used to be. Hemingway would write about this. He says, I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had heard them standing in the rain and read them in proclamation, statement over proclamation. And yet I had seen nothing sacred, and things that were glorious had no glory. Finally, only the names of places had dignity. In other words, all of the hypocrisy, all this language of lies, there is no glory. There is nothing sacred. There is only death. And so he is traumatized by this. He's trying to find a new place for himself. He's drinking a lot. And the mother has this disgusting attitude. Instead of understanding the reality he's living, she writes him this pretentious letter in which she compares a mother's love with a bank account. And she says, well, I have been doing all the early deposits and you have only been taking out. and now you are overdrawn, she says. And she kicks him out of the house. So Hemingway finds a new job in the Toronto Star. And he would continue working in a similar way to what he had done in the Kansas City Star. But now he gets to deal with a very broad variety of themes, not just criminal stories, but almost everything. And these stories that have been put together in books like this one or in his bylines are very amusing. He writes, for example, about how the true proof of valor in a man is to attend, to become a model for shaving school. He tells people how to, what is a Pernod? How do you grow a mustache? What are the good metals to have? How do you rent art? There was all these wonderful vignettes. And even though Hemingway is barely 20, he already has the tone of authority in everything that he writes and says. And at this time, he would meet another girl that would be 8 years older than him, Hadley Richardson. They fall in love, and they decide to go to Paris. Hemingway has a friendship with Sherwood Anderson, who is a prominent author, and Sherwood writes him letters to all his friends, letters of introduction. And so he is able to travel to Paris. Many years later, he would publish some of the descriptions that he did as a young man in a beautiful book called The Movable Feast that was published after Hemingway's death in 1964. But among the many beautiful descriptions that you find, he says, if you're lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast. And there is never any ending to Paris. And the memory of each person who has lived in it differs from that of any other. We always return to it no matter who we were or how it was changed or what difficulties or ease it could be reached. Paris was always worth it. And you received in return for whatever you brought to it. But this is how Paris was in the early days when we were very poor and very happy. So in Paris, that is a city that has this fabulous cultural effervescence. As Gertrude Stein would say, Paris was where the 20th century lived. It is the place where the great artists are painting, where the great writers are writing, where Picasso is living. He would meet Sylvia Beach and would, in her library, he would complete his education. So there would be so many interesting people that he would meet. Gertrude Stein, the one who coined the phrase of the lost generation, would guide him, would talk to him about painting, would correct his style. Ezra Pound would become a very influential friend. Even James Joyce. Hemingway was tall and strong and liked to box. And it is said that James Joyce, who was very short, but had a very aggressive tongue. And when he got on his cups, it was terrible. And he said they started insulting people. And when they were getting ready to attack James Joyce, he would just tell to Ernest, deal with them, Hemingway, deal with them. And then Hemingway would come in there and box them. He would even box the French champion. He would also do a lot of news stories. He would be the European correspondent of the Toronto Star. And among the many stories he would do, he would interview Mussolini, and he would denounce him as a fraud. He would remember how Mussolini had received him in this elaborate office, and he had a wolf cub, a live wolf cub next to him, and he was pretending to be reading, but then Hemingway noticed that the book he was holding was upside down. So Hadley he would go to Switzerland, and he would ask Hadley to bring him all his manuscripts because he was going to meet an important person that he wanted to share them with. And Hadley packs all of his writings and takes the train, and she gets distracted a moment, and then when she returns to her seat, somebody has stolen the suitcase. Hemingway would remember that she was just weeping unconsolably. He said, I had never seen anybody suffer so much. And when she tells him that what had happened, Hemingway tells her, well, but we still have the carbons. No, Hadley had even brought the carbons as well. So 2 years of Hemingway's early work was vanished forever. There are some critics who believe that maybe the excellence of his early stories happened because they're not the original manuscripts, but a second generation of works that he would start again from scratch. Gertrude Stein recommends him going to Spain. And specifically, she recommends him to Pamplona to see the running of the bulls. Hemingway was still very traumatized by violence in World War I. And he felt that the bullfights could give him a better understanding of violent death. So in Pamplona, they have this unique custom where they let the bulls run through the streets of the town. It's extremely dangerous. And many people walk with the bulls. Some try to practice the bullfight. So many people get gored and suffer in this process. So Hemingway is absolutely fascinated by this event. And at the same time, in 1923, he has his son, John, that he calls Nicanor in honor of a great bullfighter. These are the first books he publishes, 3 stories and 10 poems, and then especially In Our Time, a book that is absolutely extraordinary. You can read it. I did so again last week. It doesn't have one wrinkle. It's absolutely current and perfect and beautiful. He would also work with Ford Madox Ford in the Transatlantic Review, and he would meet Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. Even though they're practically the same age, I think Scott is about a year or 2 older than Hemingway, but Scott was then extremely famous. He had already published The Great Gatsby, and he was sought after by many publications. And so Fitzgerald immediately realizes that Hemingway has talent, but his editors are not that great. And so Scott tries to convince Hemingway to move from his current editor to Scribner's. There's some wonderful vignettes that Hemingway would write of Scott and Zelda. Look at this one on Fitzgerald. He says, Scott was a man then who looked like a boy with a face between handsome and pretty. He had very fair, wavy hair, a high forehead, excited and friendly eyes, and a delicate, long-lipped Irish mouth that on a girl would have been the mouth of a beauty. The mouth worried you until you knew him, and then it worried you more. And well, if you look at Fitzgerald, the description is absolutely perfect. You know, the friendly eyes, the beautiful mouth, the wavy hair, the high forehead. It shows you that. Now, Hemingway did not like Zelda at all. She could see, you know, her mental instability, and she felt that she was a danger for Scott. He would say, Zelda had hawk's eyes and a thin mouth, deep South manners and accent. And you could watch her face and you could see her mind leaving the table and go to the night's party and return with her eyes blank as a cat's and pleased. And the pleasure would show the thin line of her lips and then be gone. Now, Zelda didn't like Hemingway either. She would say that that he was a pansy with false hair in his chest, that nobody could be so masculine. And when they asked her about Hemingway's writings of Spain, she would say that is nothing, you know, that is nothing but bull slinging and bullshit, she would say. Now, the way that Hemingway would leave his current editor is that he would create a book that would be completely unacceptable. The contract said that if he presented a book that was rejected by the editor, then he was free to go to another one. And he does a satire of Sherwood Anderson, that was the most important author of his current editor, The Torrents of Spring. And so, of course, they would not be willing to publish this book. And so Hemingway is free to go to Scribner's. In many ways, this chapter shows you a mean streak in Hemingway. I mean, after all, Sherwood Anderson had been his friend and mentor. He was the one who had given him letters of introduction. And now he just basically satirizes and destroys him for his own interest. But of course, the move to Scribner's is brilliant. It would have been impossible for Hemingway to do the career that he did without Scribner's, because here he meets Maxwell Perkins, the great editor, and he would stay with Scribner's the rest of his life. So until then, he had published, newspaper articles. He had done a couple of short stories, but he understood that to solidify his reputation, he needed a novel. And he would write The Sun Also Rises. Most of Hemingway's work would later be presented in the cinema. In this case, Ava Gardner plays the main female character, Lady Brett. But what is in this first book, Hemingway basically recreates the life of the people that he lived with. So most of them are completely recognizable in the period. The female character, all of them are people that he knew and that feel very offended when the book comes out. The book is a story of this soldier that has been wounded in the war and cannot have sex, but he's still capable of feeling sexual desire. And so it is all his relationship with this attractive English woman, and then how they go to Spain, and this woman, falls in, I would say love, falls in lust with a young bullfighter that she corrupts. So when the story, when the book is published, it becomes extremely successful, but it creates a lot of distance between Hemingway and his society. Also, a problem, he would leave his first wife, Hadley, for Pauline Pfeiffer. And he would also describe this process of separation in a book that would be published posthumously, The Garden of Eden. So this problem of an author that uses his life as a material, and how, you cannot, I mean, many people have criticized Hemingway and consider him a bully because he takes this character and this other person. But Hemingway realizes that if you are a polite person that doesn't say what you really see and what you know, you're not a good author. So sometimes you sacrifice being what could be conventionally considered noble or good or discreet in favor of your art. And Hemingway begins by being brutally honest with himself. All the process of separation with Hadley that he would resent, probably. I still think that Hadley was perhaps his best companion, but he would talk about it, his own betrayal, and how it felt to be in love simultaneously with these two women, and how he leaves this wife that adored him, that had brought him to Paris, with whom he had a small child, and he leaves her for this other woman. It becomes very difficult for him to continue to live in Paris. And so his friend, John Dos Passos, recommends him to go to Key West. And Key West in Florida is a completely different environment. There is a bar there called Sloppy Joe's that is still open. And here he would meet with completely different people than the writers, poets, painters, and intellectuals that he would know in Europe. Here he would befriend fishermen, hunters. He would begin to practice other types of worlds. And it is at this time when he learns that his father had just committed suicide. It is a shock for him. And the suicidal trait, unfortunately, is very extended in Hemingway's family. You see his father commits suicide, his father-in-law commits suicide, his brother commits suicide, his granddaughter, all these people that were somehow connected to him commit suicide. In the 30s, he would write basically nonfiction. He would do some novels, but the most important books would be Death in the Afternoon, that is about bullfighting, and a theme that would concern him all of his life, which is the idea of grace under pressure. And how can somebody in the presence of death create art? Because the bullfights, it is difficult to see a great bullfight. But when you do, there is nothing more beautiful than that. It is a dance between a beast and a human being, where at every moment, people are risking their lives, not only of the bull, but of the person that is practicing the bullfight. And the book is not only about bullfighting, it is also about life. It has a wonderful ending where he says all the things that he would have wanted to include in the book that he didn't. And so he has a description of this, that he should have written about this, and he should have written about that, and he should have mentioned this long catalog. And he concludes by saying, we've seen it all go, and we'll watch it go again. The great thing is to last and get your work done and see and hear and learn and understand. And write when there's something that you know and not before and not too damn much after. Let those who want to save the world, if you can get to see it clear and as a whole, then any part you make will represent the whole if it's made truly. The thing to do is work and learn. It's so beautiful. In other words, when like a painter that does a painting that is true, the part will represent the whole. So let those who want to save the world, if you can see it, if you can grasp a part of that and see it truly and learn and observe and last. He would continue writing stories, but as I said, the other book that he does is about his hunting in Africa, the green hills of Africa. And all these experiences, you could find Hemingway's biography in his books. And not only would be reserved to the nonfiction, but he would save some of them for his stories. One of his most famous ones is the Snows of Kilimanjaro. I have never read anything as honest as this story, in which he talks about an author. Some say he could have been talking about Fitzgerald, but when I read it, I feel he's talking about himself, because it very much fits his description. He says how he marries one wife, and every new wife is richer than the past, and how he had traded on his talent, and he had dulled it by drinking and by talking about it. Very dramatic, very important. I fully recommend you to read it. Now, I would like to talk a bit about the Hemingway style, because many people think that to write like Hemingway, you basically have, it's a stylistic thing, that you have to write specific short. Well, if you do that, you probably will end up, they have a contest that's called Bad Hemingway, where people follow strictly the rules. It is so much more than that. So I have tried to summarize. I mean, I've read his letters and his ideas on writing, and I've tried to offer you a summation of his ideas on writing. And of course, if any of you is interested, let me know, and I would be glad to email them to you. But he says, like, rule number one, says observe and observe and observe, and see and listen. If your vision is incomplete, the words will be flat. Look at the world, hear what people say. What was the weather like? What noises were heard? And then he talks about how many authors use their characters as mouthpieces. So he says, if the characters should not talk about anything they wouldn't do. So if the author uses the characters to make a display of the author's erudition, he's showing off. He also he says, if a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit that he knows. And the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though he had stated them. In other words, Hemingway sometimes takes parts out. There is a story, for example, in which you have this kind of very bad relationship of a husband and wife. And then you have the interaction of the wife with a porter. And the wife says she liked his dignity and how he heard her and how he did this and that. And just by that dialogue, without him telling you that they have a horrible marriage, that the husband does not hear her, does not treat her with dignity, but this porter does for any reason. Even though he's not telling you the whole story, he is, in a way that is much more important, because then the reader feels the information. He would, he say, you should always know much more than you write. The elegance of the movement of the iceberg is because it only reveals a fraction of its body. So it says an iceberg has only 1/7 of its body. So that's why it moves so smoothly. So you should know a lot more than what you are actually writing. We'll say, avoid talking about your work. It dissipates the inner tension. And then he says, and then he has all this process. He says, wake up early while the mind is fresh, concentrate, work hard, and stop while the well is still full. He also likes to write standing up, because he says that this way, it's better for the health of the author. He advises things like work slowly. Whole writing is rewriting. And then he says, don't let yourself slip and get into any perfect characters. If you get a noble communist, remember, the bastard probably masturbates and is jealous as a cat. He says, keep them people, people, people. Do not let them get to be symbols. And then, very interesting, he says, when you have writer's block, what you do is think of one true sentence. And as soon as you feel one sentence that is absolutely true, the blocking is eliminated. And then when you reread your work, he says, try the goose flesh effect. No one can simulate goose flesh. In other words, if the writing doesn't give you that emotional feel, examine it. He says, all the process of Hemingway is not just a superficial stylistic thing. It is a process of deep understanding of yourself and the world. It's truly remarkable. Write straight English, no slang. Never use words that shock on their own value. Punctuation should be as conventional as possible. And then he says, try to remember, register what you feel, not what you were supposed to feel. When you come out to the world, you're going to write about something. Register what you really feel about it. And then observe yourself observing. So remember back until you see exactly what the action was that gave you the emotion. what is it that gave you the emotion? So for example, if people are fishing, he says, when people are fishing, what is it that gave you the emotion? Was it when, you know, the string went deep? When the fish came out and smashed itself into the water? Say, find what gave you the emotion and write it down, and make it clear so the reader can see it too. So these are just a few of these ideas. I mean, we could do a whole seminar on how to write according to Hemingway. We could use examples of his dialogues, of saying without saying, of describing. We could do exercises. I mean, Hemingway is, I cannot think of an author that teaches you how to write. If you want to write short story, if you want to write books, or if you want to write articles, there's nobody that is more clear and more intelligent than Ernest Hemingway. And Hemingway not only teaches us how to write, he also guides us in terms of what we should read. And I have found that even though he's been dead for 60 years, the books that he recommends and the order in which one should approach them is still stands. I mean, he talks about the books as boxing matches. And he says, don't even think of getting into the ring with Mr. Tolstoy, or first begin by this or that, you know. And he recommends Flaubert, Thomas Mann, Joyce, Fielding, Stendhal, Dostoevsky, Twain. He would say that all of American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn, and he's exactly right. Stephen Crane, you know, all of these, he says, you know, the Yeats autobiography, all the good Maupassant, all the good Kipling, all the good Turgenev, Henry James, very remarkable. Now, his second marriage to Pauline Pfeiffer is also in trouble. And he meets a journalist called Martha Gellhorn, which is very much his equal. She is intelligent, courageous, and beautiful. She's a war correspondent, and she is as intense as Hemingway. There is a very good movie called Hemingway and Gellhorn with Nicole Kidman and Clive Owen that is excellent. I don't know why it wasn't more successful, but I do recommend the movie to you. And with Martha, they moved from Key West to Cuba. In Cuba, he would buy this house, Finca Vigía, that has been kept 60 years later exactly the way Hemingway left it. He would publish a book, a novel that has not been very much appreciated, but I love it. It's called To Have and Have Not. And as I said before, most of Hemingway's books and many of his short stories have become movies. One of the most successful ones, in my opinion, is precisely To Have and Have Not, because it's casted absolutely perfectly. Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall are just ideal for the role. Both are at their prime. It's absolutely wonderful. But Hemingway had been almost a decade without publishing a novel, and people were getting impatient with him. And suddenly there is this accident in a government camp of World War I veterans. And because of the ineptitude of the government, they cannot get out of the facility. There's a hurricane, and many of them die. So this becomes for Hemingway kind of a shock back to reality and to the political problems that are happening. For the past years, he has been thinking of bullfighting in Africa and all these things. And now he's suddenly back into the present. And of course, with Martha Gellhorn, that is a very informed, political, active woman. They go together to the Spanish Civil War. And Hemingway not only participates, but he organizes a campaign to raise money for ambulances for the cause of the Republic. And he also produces a movie that would create awareness of the Civil War in Spain in the United States. Very important. He would document this early conflict that would somehow anticipate itself to World War II, because the Spanish army is very much propped up by the Nazis and the fascists. So Hemingway produces his movie. This movie is premiered to great acclaim. It's even seen by President Roosevelt and his wife. But even more important than the movie is the literary work that Hemingway creates. His classic novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls. This is a book in which Hemingway tries to use English in a similar way to Spanish. Fascinating. He would also do a play, The Fifth Column, and For Whom the Bell Tolls would be, a movie would be done with the beautiful Ingrid Bergman. It is about an American volunteer whose job is to blow up a bridge. And the book is extraordinary because it gives you a full view of what is happening. It's not just a propaganda piece, because it also shows you the horrors that some of the loyalists are committing as well. He returns with Martha to Cuba, and he equips his Pilar, his ship, to detect Nazi submarines. Many criticize him and say that he was more like a ploy, that it wasn't really any danger of Nazi submarines in the Caribbean. However, this experience would be later recreated in a posthumous book called Islands in the Stream. Eventually, Martha Gellhorn says, if you're going to stay here hunting Nazis in your ship and fishing, I'm going to the war. So she goes to World War II in Europe, and her work as a war reporter is extraordinary. She is part of the Normandy invasion. So eventually Hemingway goes to World War II. He's in England. He participates in the defense of England. He volunteers to go with the RAF pilots. Has a serious accident. And he would produce an anthology of writings on war, do several articles and books. But by now, the relationship with Martha Gellhorn is in very bad terms. So he would meet his last wife, Mary Welsh. In World War II, the boundaries between Hemingway as an author and Hemingway as a character become blurred. He actually takes part in some of the military actions. He helps the troops find their way into Paris. He's even tried for violating the neutrality of a correspondent. He's exonerated and even decorated. But Hemingway now it's becoming every day more difficult to be the writer that he wants to be, and at the same time to fulfill all this fantasy of what Hemingway is as a warrior or a sportsman, a drinker. He begins to, well, he's all of his life he drinks, but the drinking gets even more intense, which is some of the reasons that destroy his relationship with Martha. In Italy, he meets this beautiful young aristocrat, Adriana Ivanchik. And he would have a platonic relationship with her and would write a novel called Across the River and Into the Trees, which is this description of a colonel that falls in love with this young girl. Even Adriana volunteered some of her art for the cover of the book. But unfortunately, the book is a disaster. It's completely panned by the critics, who begin to talk of Hemingway as a spent force, as a has-been. And so he's at the lowest point of his career, with lots of health problems, drinking problems, a very hostile critics. And he tries to write a story that he had heard 20 years ago, but did not feel that he had the knowledge to write. It is a story that is very much inspired by his friend, the skipper, Gregorio Fuentes, a man that would be 104, would die at 104, and was Hemingway's teacher in terms of fishing. And so it is the story of an old fisherman who has had very bad luck, but one day goes deep into the ocean and captures this gigantic fish. But because his ship is very small, he cannot put it on board. And so when he tries to take it back, the shark completely destroy the fish. So this has the problem that he has with The Old Man and the Sea is that the size is awkward. It's too long to be considered a short story, but too short to be considered a novel. And so there is really no place to promote it. And Hemingway, of course, refuses to pad it, to make it larger. But fortunately, Life magazine agrees to publish it. And it instantly reaches millions of people. So the book becomes a complete success. The champion is back. Hemingway would win the Pulitzer Prize with it. He would be again at the top of his game. Hemingway himself would say that he had never written anything better, that his writing had reached its climax. Unfortunately, Hemingway does not change his life in its physical exertions. He goes to another safari, and this time his plane crashes, and a rescue plane comes again, and it crashes again. Hemingway has to open the door with his head, breaking his skull. He's totally destroyed. And he even gets a chance to read his own obituaries. In this extremely weakened position, he receives in 1954 the Nobel Literature Prize, the greatest award in literature, but he's too weak to receive it personally. The last, he would work, in this very difficult moment, he would receive an unexpected gift, because in the Paris Ritz, they would find 2 boxes that contained all his vignettes that he had done as a young man in Paris. So this would be the basis of his memoir, The Movable Feast, that would be published posthumously. The last work that he published in life would be The Dangerous Summer. And this is a book about the rivalry of 2 bullfighters, Luis Miguel Dominguín and Antonio Ordóñez. So he returns to Spain and he covers the story. It is published also in Life, not with the success of The Old Man and the Sea. Meanwhile, there is a revolution in Cuba, and Hemingway expresses his sympathy for the revolution and is visited by Fidel Castro. But eventually he would leave Cuba and buy a home in Idaho. He would have an extreme depression. And he develops this idea that he is being persecuted and observed and that his phones are tapped. So people around him start believing that he's paranoid. Now we know that, in fact, he was being hounded by the FBI. The hideous Hoover had him tapped. So it was not Hemingway's delirium. It was real. But tragically, the wife takes him to the Mayo Clinic. And without talking extensively about him, because they don't talk about a mental illness, they don't talk about his depression, they say that it is for cardiac reasons, but they don't even talk to Hemingway about it. So they subject him to electroshock therapy. And they give him more than 8 electroshocks in his brain. Kennedy has just been sworn in, and he wanted Hemingway to participate in his inaugural. He can't do it. And so then Jackie Kennedy is forming a book that will be presented to President Kennedy. And so she asks Hemingway if he could write her 1 short sentence for this book that would have been presented to Kennedy. And for the next 16 hours, Hemingway tries to write 1 sentence. And he can't. The electroshocks had erased his main tool of creation, which was his memory. The muses had abandoned him. And so the 2nd of July of 1961, he went downstairs. Incredibly, the wife had left the closet where they kept the guns open. And so Hemingway would pull out one of the shotguns, put it in his mouth, and committed suicide. Critic Edmund Wilson said that it was as if a whole corner of my generation had suddenly and horribly collapsed. Martha Gellhorn, the rebellious third wife, said, he was a genius. That uneasy word. Not so much in what he wrote as in how he wrote it. He liberated our written language. His brother Leicester said he wanted to be more than Superman. He wanted to be Superman's older brother. He was buried in Ketchum the 5th of July of 1961. The priest at the funeral was asked to read some passages from the book of Ecclesiastes, which was one of Hemingway's favorites. But he only read the lines that said, vanity of vanities, all is vanities. He left out the next passage that would have started Hemingway's career. That one that says how one generation passes and another generation cometh. But the earth abides forever, and the sun also rises. Thank you very much.